For this next part of the course, we're going to be talking about the politics of the judiciary. We'll pay particular attention at the federal level to the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll talk a little bit about the lower federal courts, and then we'll conclude this section with a discussion about the Nevada Supreme Court. All right, let's get started. All right, let's start where we typically start when we're talking about one of the branches of the government. We'll talk about the founding principles. What were the founders thinking when they created the federal judiciary? Foremost among them, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court, along with some lower federal courts. What they were thinking was, number one, as Alexander Hamilton said quite aptly, the courts would be the least dangerous branch of government. They would be the least powerful. So again, Article 1, right, the powers of Congress, first among equals, the power of the president, Article 2, and then finally Article 3, the power of the courts, meant to be third in line here, least among equals, if you will. Designed in significant part to be a check on majority tyranny, right? We know that the founders were in some ways skeptical of democracy, skeptical about rule by the majority, so the court would be insulated from that and would act as a check and balance on it when needed, right? Nominated by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. And this was a president elected by the Electoral College and a Senate elected by state legislatures. So designed in a variety of ways to be insulated from direct popular pressure. Also, right, terms for life to insulate them from popular pressure. Article 3 is a brief article. Article 1 is the longest of the first three articles. Article 2 is medium. Article 3 is the shortest of all. And really, there's not a lot in there about the boundaries of judicial power other than the statement that the court shall have the power to decide all cases arising under the U.S. Constitution. What did that mean exactly? A little uncertain, a certain amount of ambiguity there, typical of the Constitution in a variety of ways. This is one of them. The court seeks to clarify that in Marbury v. Madison, the godhead of all Supreme Court decisions. It was really the Keynesian era for the U.S. Supreme Court. It was their coming out party. It's when they declare themselves to be a significant player. At the beginnings of the Republic, they really weren't much of a player. They were very, very marginal. So they become more center stage with Marbury v. Madison. The case is somewhat complicated. The essence of it was Chief Justice John Marshall declared in that case that they had the power of judicial review, the power to review acts of Congress. They could compare acts of Congress to the Constitution, and if the law was inconsistent with the Constitution, they could strike that law down. So that gave them a substantial power, the power to check the power of Congress. So that's really when they start to become a significant player in American politics. We should also note, in a case like that, right, it becomes very clear that the court is in some ways a policy-making body, that by striking down the policy of Congress, they were making a kind of policy themselves. When they uphold the policies of Congress, they are validating and strengthening those policies. When they strike down parts of a law, but not others, again, right, in a sense, they are making policy. So some say that they only decide cases, and I would say, yes, they decide cases, but in doing so, will often make a form of public policy. So we have then a system at the federal level of the U.S. Supreme Court as top dog, of course, but below them we do have a significant number of lower federal courts. We have, for example, 13 appellate circuit courts that are regionally based. And I might even say roughly 13 because you also have a variety of appellate courts that are specialized. Like I think there's a patent court that's federal, a few others, but basically 13 of great significance. For example, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the circuit court that governs California. I believe it includes Hawaii, the state of Washington. It includes Nevada, right? So these are typically regionally based circuit courts, 13 of those. And then below them, you have the roughly 100 federal trial courts. I believe we have one here in Las Vegas. I believe one up in Reno. So roughly, for all 50, take all 50 states into account, roughly 2 per state, something like that, depending on how big the state is. Okay, and what we might say about these lower federal courts is they do carry much of the load of the federal judiciary. They're obviously far more numerous than the U.S. Supreme Court. I think the U.S. Supreme Court takes about 70 or 80 cases a year, so a lot of those others are dealt with by the lower federal courts. We would take note of this. The Senate does provide advice and consent for presidential nominations to all of the federal courts, but that function varies as a matter of fact and politically from one level to the next. And so what I would observe here is that Senate advice and consent, the advice part of it, is very important at the trial court level. There's 100 federal courts, federal trial courts. That's a lot of personnel constantly changing. And so the president is more than happy to get advice from senators of his or her own party on who they might nominate to serve on a federal trial court in, let's say, Las Vegas or in Boston or in San Francisco or what have you. There, the president will definitely get advice from the Senate, and they might even get advice, quite honestly, informally, from members of their own party who serve in the House of Representatives, who might have some ideas on who the president could nominate for some of these positions, even governors of the president's own party, that sort of thing. At the Circuit Court of Appeal level, Senate advice is significant. The president will certainly take that into some account. Senators of his or her own party that are within the jurisdiction of the circuit court that has an opening, the president would take that into some account, although here the president would exercise more power in determining who to nominate. And of course, at the U.S. Supreme Court level, where the stakes are super high, the president will generally not take significant advice from senators of his or her own party. There the president figures, look, this is my prerogative. The stakes are super high. I'll nominate who I want to nominate. And then you can debate it in the Senate, and you can either provide your consent or not. But the advice function really falls away at the level of the U.S. Supreme Court. So although you cannot see that in the Constitution, the Constitution would suggest that advice function is the same across all federal courts. It's not. Federal trial courts, it's most important. Circuit courts, somewhat important. U.S. Supreme Court, not really significant at all. So, presidential nominations to the Supreme Court. Let's talk about that for a bit, right? This is part of our system of checks and balances. The president nominates people to serve on the high court with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. The Senate's advice function here, quite honestly, is very limited. They're really just there to provide either consent or not consent, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the politics and the dynamics of that process. And this is in our text, so make sure you read that chapter on the court and so forth. So we know then, right, that any president is going to take ideology and party into a great deal of account. That's to be expected. The court issues very important decisions for our politics, so it becomes deeply partisan. That's unavoidable. All right, so, and party and ideology, right, are a little different. Trump, right, certainly nominated to the court Republicans, but he also sought to nominate conservative Republicans, right, as opposed to moderate Republicans. So party and ideology overlap quite a bit, but they're not quite the same thing. Demographics. Yeah, that's important, right? Initially, for a very long time, you essentially had to be white and male to get on the court. Today, the process has become more small d democratic. The court has become more diverse as our politics have become more diverse and our electorate has expanded to include all different communities. Yeah, right now we have, what is it? 1, 2, 3, is it 3? 3 women on the bench, 6 men, 1 Latina, 1 black justice,
That's all, relatively new developments here in America post the 1960s. What else do we want to say about that? Age. Age has become very important to presidents, right? Increasingly, presidents are drawn to nominate young people because the younger they are, right, the longer they might serve on the bench. So you see that with Trump's appointees on the bench. Justices Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett, all quite young. The idea, right, is you extend your influence over the court for decades. Experience and competence and credentials, right? That also counts, of course. Although that being said, right, there's plenty of experienced and competent people out there with great credentials, lots to choose from. That's considered to be, right, pretty basic. Any president, right, to some degree, has to think about who they can get through the Senate, right? Who can they get consent for? That was in some ways, right, Obama's dilemma in his final year in office was, who can I nominate to the court that can get through a Republican-controlled Senate? Turns out nothing could have been done to make that happen. But Obama did his best. He nominated someone who was pretty old and someone who was quite moderate. Right? He was hoping that might get Republicans on board. Nothing was going to get Republicans on board. So that didn't happen. But that's a good example of how a president might think about that strategically. Trump, right, didn't have any worries. Republicans controlled the Senate during his 4 years in office, so anybody he put up was going to get approved. So that dynamic is always shifting. Incidentally, right, there's pressure right now on Stephen Breyer, Democrat, to step down early in Biden's term, while Democrats still control the Senate, because they might not right after 2022. There's pressure on Breyer, who's quite old, to retire now so that Biden can nominate a fellow Democrat to replace him. The concern is, right, if you wait until 2023 or 2025, you might have a Republican-controlled Senate, and by 2025, right, maybe a Republican president. So and the idea is don't do a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I know this is harsh because she's legendary, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg never retired, held on until she died, and then she died right while Trump was still president. Some say she should have retired during Obama's first term when Obama could have replaced her with a Democrat. What happens instead, right? She dies while Trump is president. Trump gets another seat on the court. Trump has got 3 seats on the court, which is crazy. 3 justices in 4 years, that's nuts. That's Mitch McConnell at work as Senate Majority Leader. Holding off on Merrick Garland, right? Not giving Obama Garland, giving that slot instead to Trump, and then Trump got 2 more opportunities. Kennedy retired, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. That's disproportionate, but hey, them's the breaks. That's politics. There's a chance element there. Surprise justices. Sometimes presidents get surprised, right? They think they're putting somebody on the court who's conservative, and they turn out to be moderate or even liberal. That's always been the dynamic. Justices and judges tend to move to the left, never to the right that I can think of in history. So that's something that's bedeviled Republicans. Dwight Eisenhower, right, put both Earl Warren and William Brennan on the court. They both ended up being super liberal, and he was a moderate Republican who was pretty disappointed with that. H.W. Bush Sr., put David Souter on the court as a moderate Republican. He ended up being a liberal Democrat over time. And even today, you would say, it can still happen. Even though Republican presidents have gotten a lot more cautious about this and only nominating hardcore Republicans. W. Bush, right, put onto the bench John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts. And Roberts, it appears, is drifting a little bit to the left, probably in response to so many of his colleagues being Trumpers now. So I think he's a little put off by that and is moving a little bit towards the Democrats. But remember, right? That means that in a way you've got 5 hardcore Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 1 moderate Republican who sometimes joins the Democrats. That still makes it very hard for the Democrats on the court, right, to get many wins. because there's 6 Republicans. So even if Roberts defects from time to time, it's going to be hard to get too many wins. Although even then, right, at times Gorsuch and Kavanaugh have defected, mostly Gorsuch, to join the Democrats. But no question right now, it's a very conservative court, very Republican. Trump had a disproportionate impact on the makeup of the court. Them's the breaks for Democrats. Oh well, it's the way the cookie crumbles. And yeah, it's a harsh court environment right now for Democrats, no question. Okay, so you see the listing of names there. I list the 6 Republicans and then the 3 Democrats. There has been some talk of expanding the court's number to 11 from 9. Definitely legal, right? There's no fixed number. The Constitution leaves it up to Congress. It used to be 5, then it was 7, and now it's 9. Been 9 for a very long time. Democrats could make it 11 if they had 50 votes in the Senate. I don't think they do. I don't think those conservative Democrats will go along with that. That appears to be the case right now. So that's a fantasy for the Democrats. Not unreasonable in my view, but it's a fantasy. Not going to happen. Because the idea is, right, expand it to 11, give Biden 2 picks on the court, and then Republicans still would control the court. It would just be a little more evenly divided. 6 Republicans, 5 Democrats. That's not going to happen, but it's fun to think about. And then that pressure on Breyer to step down sooner rather than later. He should. I don't know that he will. I hope that he does myself, but who knows? That's up to him. All right. So these are some of the politics and some of the dynamics and some of the considerations by any president when they're thinking about how to shape the court in their preferred direction. Yeah. And then right, the court, of course, right, justices serve for life, unless they decide to step down. Most don't, but some do.